Before we begin this hauntingly beautiful tale of redemption, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Every week we bring you emotional and powerful stories from forgotten corners of the past. This story begins in a dusty town where superstition ruled more fiercely than any law. It begins with a girl, and her hair, red as fire. They called her cursed. They called her bad luck. But none of them truly knew her. None cared to. Until one man did, a preacher with more ghosts than followers, and a silence heavier than any sermon. What brought them together was pain. What kept them together was something far stronger. Her name was Annabel, though most in the town of Dry Hollow refused to call her that. To them, she was witch girl, devil's flame, that red-headed thing. Ever since she was born, strange things seemed to follow her. A lightning bolt splitting the chapel's cross, a swarm of crows appearing during communion, a well that ran dry right after she walked by. Her only crime? Being born with fiery red hair and eyes too green for comfort. Her parents tried to protect her, but the town grew meaner every year. By the time she was 10, she walked alone, head down, barefoot in dust. They whispered behind her back, but sometimes they didn't bother. "She'll bring fire," the butcher once said. "Mark me, that girl will curse this town to ashes." The preacher, Pastor Elijah Brooks, heard all of it. He never spoke, just watched. He lived at the edge of town, in a wooden church no one really visited anymore. His sermons had gone silent long ago. Some said he was mourning a wife, others, a child. All they knew was he didn't smile, and no one dared knock on his door, until Annabel did. It was the first cold night of the season. Wind bit through cracked windows and chimneys spat smoke into the sky. Annabel stood on the preacher's steps, shivering, barefoot, her red hair tangled like wildfire. "I'm sorry," she said. "I just needed somewhere warm." Elijah didn't say a word. He just opened the door. No questions. No judgment. Inside, the church smelled of old wood and dust, the pews worn and the altar forgotten. But it was warm. And it was safe. For Annabel, it was the first place that didn't spit her back out. She returned the next night. And the next. Every evening, Elijah opened the door. He never preached. He never lectured. He simply let her sit, sometimes in silence, sometimes reading from old books, sometimes just staring at the single stained glass window that cast golden light over the floor. "Why do they hate me?" she asked one night. Elijah paused before replying, "Because people fear what they can't control. And fire, real or imagined, can't be tamed." That was the most he'd said in weeks. Annabel never forgot it. The town noticed. Annabel was no longer walking the streets at dusk. She wasn't huddled behind the bakery or sleeping near the barn. She was with the preacher, and that set tongues wagging. "She's poisoned his mind," they said. "He's falling under her spell." But Elijah didn't flinch. He began to clean the chapel, fix the steps, repaint the altar. The bell, silent for years, rang again one morning. It startled the whole town. "Why now?" they asked. Elijah simply said, "Because someone's finally listening." Annabel began helping. She scrubbed floors, polished pews, and brought wildflowers to decorate the dusty corners. The two of them barely spoke, but they didn't need to. There was an understanding between them. One of pain, yes, but also of healing. Elijah never asked about her parents, and she never asked why the grave behind the chapel had no name. Some grief doesn't require explanation. Some hearts just recognize another that's been broken. Then came the storm. 3 days of thunder, of wind howling like wolves, of lightning splitting the sky in jagged veins. The river overflowed. Livestock drowned. Crops flattened. People panicked. And guess who they blamed? Annabel. Her hair called the lightning, they shouted. "She's brought ruin again." A mob formed by the second day. torches, pitchforks. The sheriff didn't stop them. Fear had taken over, and fear is louder than justice. They marched to the church, demanding Elijah send her out. "She's cursed," they yelled. "She'll burn us all." Elijah stood at the doorway, blocking their path. He said nothing, just looked each man in the eye. Then he did something no one expected. He opened the chapel doors wide and stepped aside. Annabelle walked out, head held high. The mob stepped back. For a girl of just 14, she held herself like royalty. "If I'm cursed," she said, "then may my curse be that I survive you." The mob didn't know how to respond. But the storm ended that same night. The river receded. The winds calmed. And the skies cleared with a warmth that hadn't been felt in weeks. The next morning, the crops looked greener than before. It was as if the land had been washed clean. Still, the townsfolk said nothing. But they watched. Quietly. Suspiciously. Yet they could not deny one truth. The church had changed. And so had the preacher. And Annabelle, she wasn't a child anymore. She was something more, something they could no longer control. After the storm, Elijah started building. Not just fixing. Building. A small house beside the chapel. White, sturdy, modest. Annabelle asked what it was for. He replied, "You'll need your own space someday." She didn't argue. She painted the walls herself. Every evening, townsfolk would peek from behind fences. Whispers rose again. But no one dared approach. The preacher was no longer a mystery. He was a man on a mission. And that mission had red hair and a past no one could erase. Inside the house, Elijah made space for books. Dozens of them. Old poetry, history, science, the very things Annabelle was told she'd never understand. A cursed girl shouldn't read, they once said. But she devoured every page. And each book was a brick laid in her new identity. She was learning not just how to survive, but how to think, to question, to dream. Elijah never praised her out loud. But every time she read something new, he'd leave a fresh book on the table. A quiet approval. The years passed, and the seasons turned. Annabelle grew into a fierce, brilliant young woman. Her hair still shone like fire, but it no longer scared her. It was her crown. Elijah's sermons returned, not in words, but in actions. He fixed roofs for widows, delivered food to the sick, helped bury the dead. The town, reluctantly, began to see him again. And through him, they began to see her. Not with love. Not yet. But with less hatred. That was enough. One evening, Annabelle stood by the old tree near the grave. "Will they ever forget?" she asked. Elijah, older now, thinner, leaned on his cane. "They don't need to forget," he said. "They just need to learn who you really are." She nodded. Then asked the question she'd buried for years. "Why did you help me?" Elijah looked out at the setting sun. "Because once, someone found me in the dark, and lit a match." He never said more. Rumors still floated, that she bewitched him, that the house was unnatural. But no one dared act. The town had seen too much. When a fire broke out near the mill, it was Annabelle who rode in with water. When sickness hit the children, it was her who stayed up nights nursing them with herbs and old remedies. They called her cursed, but now they knocked on her door. "Miss Annabelle," they said, "please, help us." And she did. One winter, Elijah grew sick. The kind of sickness that doesn't leave. Annabelle sat by his bedside, reading psalms and brushing his graying beard. "Don't leave," she whispered one night. "Not yet." He smiled, weakly, but it was a smile. "I already gave you my last sermon," he said. "It was made of nails and paint and 4 walls. Your home is my goodbye." She cried for the first time in years. He passed quietly in his sleep on the first day of spring. The church bell rang at dawn, not for a sermon, but for a farewell. The whole town came, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Annabel wore white that day, not to mourn, but to honor. Elijah had given her a second life, and she intended to live it fully. She took over the church, not as a preacher, but as a guide. She opened the doors to all who had been cast out, orphans, widows, the broken. She taught girls to read, taught boys to listen. The chapel became something new, not just a place of worship, but of healing. People no longer looked at her hair. They looked at her hands, always building, always serving. And slowly, Dry Hollow changed. The town that once feared fire now gathered around its warmth. Annabel wasn't just accepted, she was trusted. When disputes broke out, they asked her to mediate. When babies were born, they asked her to bless them. Her name returned. Not witch girl, not devil's flame, just Annabel. And that was enough. Behind the chapel, beside the nameless grave, she planted a garden. Lavender, sage, and wild roses. And in the center, a single stone carved with care. He built me a home. No name, no date, just truth. Elijah didn't need to be remembered in books. He lived in her. And now, in the town that once turned its back on both of them, years passed like pages fluttering in the wind. The town of Dry Hollow, once hardened by fear and folklore, now stood as a place of quiet resilience. Children played near the chapel. Laughter replaced whispers. And through it all, Annabel remained, steady, radiant, and unshaken. She wore her red hair proudly now, never tying it back, letting it flow like a banner of defiance and grace. Her presence was no longer questioned, it was needed. And with each day, the house Elijah built became more than shelter, it became the town's beating heart. Inside those white walls, decisions were made, tears were dried, futures were drawn on paper by candlelight. And Annabel, the girl they once feared, became their compass. Travelers began to arrive, hearing rumors of a town led by a woman once thought to be cursed. They came to see for themselves, and stayed. One woman brought a daughter who refused to speak. After weeks with Annabel, the girl began to sing. A man whose hands trembled from war found peace tilling the chapel garden. They didn't just find Annabel. They found themselves. She never asked for praise, never sought credit, but word spread. And slowly, Dry Hollow became something rare in the West, a place of refuge, built on the backs of two outcasts. The church wasn't just a church. It was a lighthouse, and she was its keeper, silent, strong, unshakable. Despite all she gave, Annabel kept to her routine. Each morning she lit a single candle for Elijah. Each night, she sat by the stained glass window, now restored with a new figure, a flame at the center of a heart. For fire that warms, not burns, she once told the glassmaker. She spoke to Elijah still, sometimes out loud, sometimes in her thoughts. When she laughed, it was for him. When she cried, it was into the same wooden pew she once slept on as a girl. Her grief never left, but it softened like evening light. Not sharp, not blinding, just present. One autumn, a group of townsfolk approached her with an idea. "We'd like to name the square after him," they said. "Pastor Elijah's Way." Annabel declined. "He wouldn't want that," she replied. "He built things, not for names, but for people." So instead, they planted a great oak tree. No plaque, no ceremony, just roots, deep ones, like the kind Elijah gave her. It became the town's gathering spot, and every child knew the story, passed from parent to child, not as legend, but as truth. And in that truth, Elijah remained alive, not as a ghost, but as a seed that had taken root. Annabel grew older, but never weaker. Her voice carried further. Her gaze calmed storms. When newcomers arrived, they were told, "Ask Annabelle. Not the mayor. Not the sheriff. Her." Because even after all the years, people trusted her heart more than any title. One boy once asked, "Were you really cursed?" She smiled. "No," she said. "But I was once made to believe I was. That's worse." She leaned down, brushed his hair aside, and whispered, "Never let fear name you." Those words would echo in that boy's mind for decades, long after Annabelle's name became legend. The time came when Annabelle could no longer walk the entire town. Her knees ached. Her eyes dimmed. But her spirit, oh, her spirit, burned brighter than ever. She spent her final years writing letters, hundreds of them, to children who grew up and moved away, to widows, to friends, each signed with the same phrase, "Build someone a home." Because that was what Elijah did, and what she did in turn. Even in her fading days, she lit fires in the hearts of others, the kind that warms, not consumes. On the first day of winter, she closed her eyes for the last time. Peacefully. Alone, but not lonely. The bell rang again. This time, not for a funeral, but a celebration. The whole town wore red ribbons in their hair. Not in mourning, but in honor. Children read her letters aloud on the chapel steps. Stories, lessons, wisdom. Her legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was carried in their voices. And the house Elijah built stood taller than ever, not in wood, but in memory. They didn't bury her beside Elijah. Instead, they scattered her ashes in the garden she had tended all those years, among lavender and sage and the wild roses she loved most. Every spring, they bloomed brighter. The town swore it was magic. And maybe it was, because nothing planted with love ever truly dies. And Annabelle, she had become love itself, a fierce, quiet, blazing kind of love. The garden became sacred, not because of what was buried, but because of what was sown. Visitors still come to Dry Hollow. They ask for stories, and the town tells them, not with exaggeration, not with legend, but with warmth. There was once a girl they called cursed, they say. But she wasn't. She was light. She was truth. And a lonely preacher gave her what no one else would. They point to the house, the church, the garden, and they say, This is her. Because Annabelle was never just one person. She became part of everyone who ever called that place home. And now, you've heard her story too. If it moved you, if it reminded you that kindness can outlive cruelty, that fire can purify as much as it destroys, then honor it. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who needs to remember that love still builds homes. Even in the wildest, darkest corners of the world, one act of courage can echo for generations. This was the story of Annabelle and Elijah. And it won't be forgotten, not as long as hearts keep listening.